President.
The senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, we're not on a quorum call now. Is that correct?
We are not.
Okay. Mr. President, I rise to speak briefly about a bill that I have introduced. This is a bill that's about protecting our kids in schools. And as a father of 3 young kids, I share the feeling that I suspect every parent has. There is no higher priority than making sure our children are safe. We can't personally provide that security all day, everywhere, at all times. And so we want to make sure that the places our kids go are as safe as they can be. Our kids obviously spend a great deal of time at school, and we want our schools to be the safest environment that they can be. And it turns out there's more that we can do. And so I have a bill. It's a bill that I've introduced with Joe Manchin, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia. It's a bipartisan bill, and it is going to help provide greater security for kids in our schools. Madam President, my immediate inspiration for introducing this bill came from a tragic story that originated in Pennsylvania. It's a story that begins at a school in Delaware County. One of the school teachers, it turns out, had molested several boys and had raped one. The prosecutors never felt like they had enough evidence to actually mount a case against him, but the school knew what had happened, and so they dismissed the teacher. But unbelievably to me, although they dismissed him, they also gave him a letter of recommendation that he could take with him as he applied. Where do you think? To other schools, because that's what these predators do. They look to be in an environment where they can find more victims. That's exactly what this guy did, and he managed to get another teaching job in West Virginia. The story, this episode, ends in 1997 when that teacher, who by then was a school principal, raped and murdered a 12-year-old boy named Jeremy Bell. So justice has caught up with that teacher. He has since been apprehended, charged, tried, and convicted. He's now serving a jail sentence for the murder. But that all was too late for Jeremy Bell. Unfortunately, Jeremy Bell's story is not unique. I was at a YMCA in Chester County, Pennsylvania, just a few weeks ago. Our district attorney there, Tom Hogan, is the district attorney for Chester County, and he told me a very disturbing story. They're doing an investigation of the Coatesville School District for alleged financial mismanagement. That's what the investigation is about. But in the course of the investigation, they discovered that there are numerous school employees who are felons. Now, he couldn't reveal many details because it's an ongoing investigation, even now, but he was able to share one story. It's a story of a Victor Ford, who was an employee. He'd been convicted 3 times for felony drug dealing. 2009, he was hired as a special education classroom aide and a 7th grade boys basketball coach. 2010, he raped a young girl, not at the school. Later, he resigned from the school and has since pled guilty to corruption of minors. This is just appalling, and it is so completely unacceptable anywhere in America. So I've introduced a bill, and it's a bill that has broad bipartisan support. In fact, it's a bill that has passed the House unanimously. This should not be controversial. What it would do, it would insist that schools conduct proper criminal background checks for both existing and prospective employees, and that these background checks be repeated periodically. There are 5 states that don't require any checks at all, according to the GAO report. And my state of Pennsylvania requires it only for new hires, but never relooks at people who may have been working for the school for many years. Second thing that this bill does is it requires the background check for a criminal history be done for any employee who's going to come into contact with kids. So not just teachers, but it could be a coach, it could be a contractor, it could be anybody who's going to interact with children. There are 12 states that have no such provisions. And it would also require a more thorough background check. Some states check their own state's database for criminal activity, but they don't look at the FBI's database. They don't look at a national record of criminality. Our bill would require that. It would forbid knowingly passing on a letter of recommendation to a predator. It is shocking that that even has to be contemplated, but since it has occurred, and sometimes there is this feeling that, well, let's just make the problem someone else's problem. It does happen. It's outrageous and appalling. It needs to be forbidden, and our bill would do that. And it also would preclude the possibility of hiring people ever convicted of a violent sexual crime against a child, whether that's a misdemeanor or a felony, and a number of other violent felonies, including homicide, child abuse or neglect, crimes against children, including pornography, other serious crimes, and other felonies if they had been committed within the previous 5 years. The enforcement mechanism basically is to withhold federal funding for schools in states that refuse to do an appropriate check to make sure our kids are safe. So, Madam President, I think this is just common sense. It has broad bipartisan support. Again, I want to thank Senator Joe Manchin for being my co-sponsor on this legislation. It's called the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act. It's S. 1596. Again, it passed the House unanimously. But I think this is more than just a piece of legislation. This is a moral imperative. There's something we know we can do to make our schools safer for our kids, and I think we should just do that. So I'm engaged in discussions with some of my colleagues. I should hope that this would not be controversial. It's my hope that we will soon get to the point where we can pass this by unanimous consent or hotline this so that we can get this done. As I said, it's already passed the House. As soon as we pass this bill, it will go to the President and it will be signed into law. So, Madam President, I hope my colleagues will join me in this effort and we'll be able to get it done soon. And I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Nebraska.
Are we in quorum call?
Senate is not in a quorum call.
Madam President, I rise today to speak again about the President's health care bill, Obamacare. Monday of this week was another milestone for Obamacare. It marked yet another admission by the President that the health care law is unworkable as written. So what happened? On Monday, unilaterally, the administration decided to delay the employer mandate for a year once again. This time around, the delay is for employers with 50 to 99 employees. It's amazing to me, and it's completely contradictory, that one day the President is behind the podium talking about how great this law is, and the next day he's erasing the very text which he supports. The administration had nearly 4 years to implement the major provisions of the law. Yet the President finds it necessary to literally rewrite the law with delay after delay after delay. Now, on one hand, I'm pleased that the President recognizes the grievous harm that is being done by this legislation. I appreciate that he recognizes that the harm is just too great to leave it in place. But all he is doing is delaying the pain until after the elections, which is unfair to American families. The truth is, further delays don't solve the problem. They just extend the pain. Reports certainly indicate we've only seen the tip of this iceberg. Last week, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office dealt yet another blow to Obamacare. The CBO estimates that there will be about 2.5 million fewer full-time workers in just 10 years than if this law had passed. These new figures are nearly 3 times greater than the CBO's already dismal analysis back in the day when the law was being debated before its passage. I found it remarkable back when we were debating this law, when unemployment was hovering around 10%, that any of my colleagues would support any bill that would cost hundreds of thousands of jobs. Now we're learning the truth. and it's even worse. It's 3 times as bad. CBO says the law, subsidies, and taxes reduce incentives to work. Is that what this Congress should be about? And their report asserts that the cost of the employer mandate penalty will be passed on to workers in the form of lower wages or other compensation. Now, a number of Nebraskans have reached out to me. An individual from eastern Nebraska shared this, quote, "I work part-time and I've had my hours cut from 30 to 28 hours due to Obamacare last April. My employer implemented it early to be sure that I did not exceed 30 hours in the year 2013. Even with the delay in the mandate, they have stuck to the 28 hours for part-time help. The loss to me is about $150 a month, and it sure has hurt our budget. My employer's hands are tied as they would have to pay health care for employees with 30 hours or more, or pay a fine if not offering health care. This Obamacare is a job killer. I keep hoping I will wake up and this will all have been a bad dream," unquote. Another Nebraskan from the northeast corner of the state wrote to me and said, quote, "My wife just left my office in tears. She worked for the city for over 10 years. She is, or rather was, a 34-hour-a-week employee who was informed that she is having her hours cut back to 29 as a result of the Affordable Care Act. To many, those 5 hours per week may not seem like much, but to our family, it will result in a huge loss. We currently have 3 children, including one daughter who's a senior getting ready to graduate and go on to college. As a family, we pretty much live hand to mouth with our income, and this reduction in hours, which I'm sure seems minor to a lot of folks, is a huge blow to my family. The thing that pains me most is the impact it's going to have on our daughter's decision about college. That one thing alone is so unfair. She should not, in the cusp of choosing her path in life, have to be put in the position over 5 hours' work of delaying or altering life plans. In a world where we tend to be futurists, always talking about the importance of education and the next generation being our future, it just doesn't seem right that I have to look my daughter in the eyes tonight and have a discussion about how 5 hours may alter her future," unquote. Now, Madam President, these are such heartbreaking stories about Americans who want to work, but their government has gotten in their way. We've seen smaller paychecks and a 2.5 million number, fewer full-time equivalent jobs is what that number means. We all remember that this law's primary marketing pitch was that it would provide coverage for tens of millions of uninsured Americans. But CBO now estimates that 31 million Americans will likely be without health insurance in 2024, and that's roughly 1 of 9 Americans. And 6 to 7 million Americans won't get coverage through their employers who otherwise would have, according to CBO. Let me say that again. 6 to 7 million fewer Americans will not get health insurance from their employer under Obamacare, compared to no bill at all. So Obamacare has been counterproductive, to say the least. It's hardly a good return on investments, considering this law cost about $2 trillion, raised taxes about $1 trillion. I appreciate and support the goals to help the most vulnerable Americans. And I support reforms that increase competition and lower costs I support reforms that expand health savings account, not reduce them. I appreciate the opportunity to work on reforms that allow insurers to compete across state lines and allow small businesses to pool together to create a broader pool to be insured and lower rates. These solutions would produce results, but a 2,700-page bill packed full of perverse incentives and negative consequences that hurt workers, increase taxes, and cost trillions is not what America wants. That's why I'm committing to shielding Americans from the harmful effects of Obamacare. We must repeal this law and build on the alternative solutions that have been proposed by Republicans to help our American families. Madam President, I thank you, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Arkansas.
Madam President, I just have a quick notification, and I'm going to let my other colleagues speak here. We have two judges that are on the calendar from Arkansas. It's calendar number 565 and 570. I'm not going to ask for unanimous consent at this moment, but I do intend to very shortly. And I just wanted to alert the Senate that I would like to, at the proper time, ask for unanimous consent that we confirm these en bloc. And I have, I think, very strong reasons why they need to get done before we go for recess. But with that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the time until 11:15 a.m. be equally divided between myself and the senators from Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, and both senators from Connecticut. And at the conclusion of these remarks, I be recognized to speak for an additional 3 minutes, and that following my remarks, the Senate proceed to executive session under the previous order.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, what has made America strong is that we've provided opportunities for individuals to develop their talents. Previous generations of Americans have recognized this, and they've invested in higher education accordingly. During President Lincoln's time, the federal government invested in establishing a system of public colleges throughout the nation. After World War II, we opened the doors of post-secondary education to our returning soldiers and sailors and airmen under the GI Bill. As part of the war on poverty, we enacted the Higher Education Act with the idea that no American should be denied the ability to go to college because their family lacked the means to pay for college. Senator Pell, my predecessor, with the creation of the Basic Opportunity Grant, later named the Pell Grant in his honor, made that promise of a college education real for millions of Americans. As part of the student aid programs, we invest in offering low-cost loans to create opportunity, spur innovation, and grow our economy. Our student loan programs were originally seen as an investment, not a profit center or even a cost-neutral proposition. Today, our student investment aid has been stood on its head, though. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that we will be generating revenue through student loans through 2024. And student loan debt has become a serious threat to our ladder of opportunity, our pathway to progress for this generation and for our economy. And that is what brings me and my colleagues to the floor today. We must turn the tide because too many students are drowning in debt, and it has threatened to hold back a new generation of young Americans just when they would be forming a household, buying a car, starting a business. As student loan repayment plans stretch out over 20 years or more, this generation will still be paying off student loan when it comes time to send their own children to college, and perhaps even taking care of their parents in their senior years. The bottom line is we know that borrowers are struggling. We know the government could play a more constructive role in helping them and enacting reforms to increase fairness and transparency in this process. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York recently reported that delinquency rates on student loan debt are increasing even as we see decreases in delinquency rate for other types of household debt. The cohort default rates for student loans have been increasing. For borrowers who entered repayment in 2010, 14.7% had defaulted by 2013, up from 13.4% for those who began repayment in 2009. It is essential that borrowers know about their repayment options. That is why Senator Durbin's Borrower's Bill of Rights is so important and why I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of his legislation. But changing the trend of growing debt and rising defaults is more than a student loan servicing issue. We have to provide a real avenue to allow individuals straining under the weight of the estimated $1.2 trillion in student loan debt, many with loans carrying an interest rate of 6.8% or higher, an opportunity to refinance those loans to a lower interest rate. The GAO just reported that on loans made between 2007 and 2012, the federal government is estimated to make $66 billion. Clearly, borrowers are paying more than they should, and we have to address these college costs. But we also have to deal with the issue of giving colleges and universities their incentive, their skin in the game, to ensure that they carefully review their loans, that they direct students to the lowest possible loans, that they do this in a way that will make them truly responsible and conscious of the debt that's accumulating by students. And so I have been working on legislation to require that. So let me commend Senator Durbin, Senator Warden, and others for what they're doing to deal with this issue. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield the floor to my other colleagues.
Madam President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam President. And I want to thank Senator Durbin and Senator Reid for their extraordinary leadership on this important issue. I also rise today to talk about the crushing burden that student debt places on our college students and on our economy, and call on Congress to address it. The core facts are well known to every family in America. In recent decades, college costs have skyrocketed. Adjusted for inflation, a young person today pays 300% of what her parents paid just 30 years ago. Millions of young people, the only way to cover this tuition cost is to take on huge debt. The average student loan balance among 25-year-olds who borrow has grown by 91% in just 10 years. Total outstanding student loan debt stands at a staggering $1.2 trillion, and it's getting bigger every single day. The problem is made worse by a federal student loan program with high interest rates that will produce obscene profits for the government. The GAO recently projected that the government will bring in $66 billion in profits on its federal student loans made between 2007 and 2012. Profits that would make a Fortune 500 CEO proud. This exploding debt is crushing our young people. More than a third of borrowers under the age of 30 have been delinquent for more than 90 days. This exploding debt is also dragging down our economy. With monthly loan bills that can easily exceed a mortgage payment, it's no surprise that homeownership among 30-year-olds has declined steeply. And last spring, the Federal Reserve raised concerns that rising student debt may threaten our overall economic growth. Tying students to a lifetime of financial servitude as a condition of getting an education does not reflect our values. These students didn't go to the mall to run up charges on a credit card. They worked hard and they learned new skills that will benefit this country, help us build a stronger middle class, and help us build a stronger America. They deserve our support. They don't deserve to be buried in debt. To reverse this trend of student borrowing, we need to bring down the cost of college. That will not be easy, and it will require everyone, the government, higher education institutions, and the students themselves, to do far more than they do now. I am committed to working with Chairman Harkin and my colleagues on the Senate Help Committee to find ways to meaningfully reduce college tuition. And I'm working closely with many of my colleagues, including Senator Durbin, Senator Reid, Senator Schumer, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Murphy, and Senator Brown, who are all intensely focused on this issue. But our need to reduce the cost of college must not blind us to the urgency of addressing the massive debt that's already crushing our young people. The pressure is building, and we must act to provide real relief to our students and young graduates now. In the coming weeks, I will join with my colleagues to introduce legislation to do just that, legislation that will allow eligible borrowers with high-interest loans to refinance at interest rates that are at least as low as those currently being offered to new borrowers in the federal student loan program. The idea is pretty simple. When interest rates are low, homeowners can refinance their mortgages. Big corporations can swap more expensive debt for cheaper debt. Even state and local governments have refinanced their debts. But a graduate who took out an unsubsidized loan before July 1st of this year is locked into an interest rate of nearly 7%. Older loans run 8%, 9%, and even more. Last year, Congress agreed that those interest rates were much too high, so they lowered them significantly for this year's borrowers. But that change does nothing for the millions who are trapped under the old high-interest rate loans. Refinancing those old loans would lower interest rates to 3.86% for undergraduate loans. The savings would vary, of course. For a recent graduate who borrowed the maximum, payments would drop by as much as $1,000 a year, and total interest could be cut nearly in half. For those who have even older loans, those with graduate school loans,
Senator's time has expired.
And those with loans from private lenders, the savings would be even higher. Thank you, Madam President. I yield back.
Madam President, I urge...
The Senator from New York.
I agree with my colleague from Massachusetts. She says it exactly right, as does the other senators who are going to speak on this issue today. I urge the Congress to work immediately to tackle the mountain of student debt that is crippling the lives of young people and weighing down an entire generation. The Federal Student Loan Refinancing Act, which I wrote to address the growing economic burden facing our graduates and their families, basically affords a graduate the same right to refinance their loans as already provided to homeowners, corporations, and even government. This legislation would lower interest rates on refinancing student loans to 4%, saving borrowers thousands of dollars that would otherwise be spent purchasing a home or a car or even starting a new business. In New York State and across the nation, we are facing a student loan debt crisis. Student loan debt is at $1.2 trillion nationwide. Americans now owe more on their student loans than they do on their credit cards, car loans, holding back our economy and our economy's growth. For tens of millions of young people who graduated college and securing their first jobs, they are not starting their careers on even ground. They're starting them underwater and have a hard time staying afloat when juggling all of their bills. A New York student who borrows to pay for college now graduates with an average of more than $27,000 in student loan debt, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. When you owe upwards $30,000 in debt before you've even earned your first paycheck, it's no wonder that young people are falling further behind on their payments. Providing graduates with the ability to refinance their student debt, federal loans particularly, would lead to the personal savings of $14.5 billion nationwide in the first year alone, according to the Center for American Progress report. A higher education remains the clearest path to our middle class. When we price young people out of college, we all pay the price. Keeping a high-quality education in New York affordable is simply the right thing to do. That's why refinancing federal student loans should be one of Congress's top priorities for college students. The magnitude of the problem requires leadership, and the solution is right in front of us. Now is the time to act. Our nation's students, graduates, and families cannot afford further delay. I yield the floor, Madam Chairwoman, and I suggest I yield the floor, Madam Chairwoman.
Madam President.
The Senator from Illinois.
Madam President, I want to thank my colleagues, Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, Senator Gillibrand of New York for joining us on the floor this morning to talk about the student debt crisis and college affordability. I don't think this is just another issue. I think this is a defining issue. Imagine, if you will, what has happened to America since we've called into question the intrinsic value of owning a home. That used to be built into our culture. The notion that if you could get beyond the rental stage and actually buy a home, it was a smart investment, number one, and a good investment in terms of your neighborhood, your community, your state. Well, the mortgage crisis that we went through was a shock to many people. They paid too much for their homes. They found themselves facing foreclosure and short sales. And the basic premise has been challenged. There's more rental property now. People are hedging their bets on the issue of home ownership. Now take one of the other pillars of our basic American values, and that pillar is you'll never go wrong with more education. I learned that at an early age. Luckily, my mom and dad, with limited education experience on their own part, pushed me forward into college, into law school, to finish, with the belief that at the end of the day, I would be better off. And of course, statistics bear that out. But now comes this new challenge. The increasing cost of higher education drives many families deeply in debt, many students deeply in debt, to the point where many times it's impossible for them to pay back their debts. As Senator Reid says, it's transformative. You'll have young people who literally have their lives dramatically changed because of debt. And it's called into question. The basic premise is a higher education worth the money. I didn't think I'd ever see that as a legitimate topic for debate in America, but it turned out to be a cover on Time magazine. So it's not just a matter of the pundits and politicians talking about it. Average people, working families are talking about it. That's why we're coming to the floor here. And we hope to expand our numbers more and more, and I hope some of our Republicans will join in this conversation about what to do when it comes to student debt and the crisis it's creating. Millions of Americans pursue a college education, hoping that they'll realize the American dream. But as college tuition, textbooks, and fees skyrocket, students are paying more and more for education and taking on greater debt to pay for it. 68% of the class of 2012 graduated with some debt, an average of about $27,850 a year. The average debt was close to $40,000 for those students who attended for-profit schools, which deserve a special part of this conversation when we talk about the cost of higher education. Americans now collectively hold more than $1.2 trillion in student debt, more than Americans hold in credit card debt. This has surpassed credit card debt in America. It goes way beyond higher education. It goes into a question about personal credit, chances for mobility, and the future of students who sign up for these bone-crushing debt loads. In his recent State of the Union address, President Obama said he wants to work with Congress to see how we can help Americans who feel trapped by this crushing debt. Well, Mr. President, several of us are stepping up and accepting your challenge. I hope more members will as well. Late last year, Senators Reid, Warren, myself, Senator Barbara Boxer of California introduced the Student Loan Borrowers Bill of Rights to spell out in basic terms the rights of student borrowers and their families in interacting with federal and private lenders, loan servicers, and schools. It's amazing to me that when it comes to mortgage debt, there are laws dictating what you need to be told. When it comes to student debt, not nearly the protections. And younger people who are making these life-changing decisions about debt deserve to know everything that they face and what they're getting into. I met a young woman in Chicago recently. Her name's Hannah Moore. She thought she did the right thing. She started off her higher education by going to community college. She was told that's affordable, close to home. Do that first. She did it. And then she made a fatal error. After 2 years at a community college, she enrolled at the Harrington College of Design in Chicago. If you'll go to their website, you will be dazzled with the beauty of this school and the faculty and all the opportunities. Hannah Moore was dazzled. But this for-profit school ended up becoming a debt pit for her life. After she had exhausted all her federal loans and started taking out private loans at the Harrington College of Design, she graduated with a debt of $124,000, and she couldn't find a job. At one point, she was working 3 part-time jobs to pay $800 a month on this debt from this for-profit school. Her federal loan payments are manageable because the federal program at least allows her to make payments based on income, but the private loans that this school lured her into, thanks to interest and fees, now amount to $110,000. Her servicer on these loans refuses to work with her to find repayment alternatives. She sinks deeper and deeper every day into debt. This poor young woman thought she was doing the right thing going to school. Today, she's so deeply in debt, she can't even dream of buying a house, a car. Her father had to come out of retirement to help her pay off the loans at this for-profit school, the Harrington College of Design. Unfortunately, she wasn't protected with the Bill of Rights, which I've introduced and is being co-sponsored by my colleagues who've spoken today, which would have told her, don't apply for a private loan until you've exhausted your government loans. They are lower interest rate, more manageable, loans that can be consolidated, even in some cases forgiven, depending on the jobs that you take. No, she wasn't told that. She was lured into this debt trap by a school that just wanted to rake in the federal dollars at her expense. This is going to standardize policies, like how payments are applied to principal and interest, so that borrowers benefit instead of banks. Under the current situation, many students paying back their loans find that the money is going to the higher interest loans and not to the lower interest loans. It's not being transferred to their benefit. The bill requires services to have a service member and veterans liaison. Veterans are often victims of these notorious for-profit schools and other lenders. We also require students to be told of all their options, including federal loans, with better terms and repayments. Students often have no other choice but to take out loans to pay for college education, but this bill says borrowing money for college doesn't mean you give up your power over your money and your debt. I also want to tell you something that most people don't know. In bankruptcy court in America today, there are only a handful of debts that cannot be discharged in bankruptcy court: taxes and government payments, child support, alimony, and government student loans. A few years ago, the for-profit industry and the private loan industry engineered into these bankruptcy discharge laws a protection for their own debt. What does it mean? It means if you go to a for-profit school and take out a private loan, you are literally burdened with that for a lifetime. The grounds for discharging a student loan debt are some of the strictest and toughest in America. So students who sign up for this debt ought to know they're in it until it's paid, and that can mean for a lifetime. The Wall Street Journal reported some time ago of a grandmother co-signing a student loan for her granddaughter. The granddaughter defaulted, and they decided to levy on the grandmother's Social Security payments. That's how outrageous this has become. And sadly, these students don't realize when they're signing on the dotted line at age 19, 20, and 21, they're signing up for a debt that can trail them for a lifetime. That's got to change. We have got to follow Senator Reid's lead. Senator Jack Reid has said these colleges have to have some skin in the game. If they're going to lure students into student loans well beyond their ability to repay, let that college and university bear some of the responsibility for repayment too. I think that's only reasonable. So I want to thank my colleagues for bringing this issue up. I want to thank Senator Warren. Her partnership in this effort is especially important because of her background in law and finance. She can be an important part of this conversation. We're not going to end with this speech on the floor today by each of us. We're going to continue once a week to bring together those in our caucus, and I hope in the Republican caucus, who believe we have to address the student debt crisis and come up with a reasonable way for students to pay for an education that is reasonably priced. To have these students burdened with the student loan debtor prison is unacceptable in America today. It is time for us as a Congress to address this issue, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Madam President, I'd like to speak for just another minute about the issue of refinancing student loans. This is real money back in the pockets of people who invested in their education, real money that will help young people find a little more financial stability as they work hard to build their futures, real money that says that America invests in those who get an education. We don't need to add a single dime to our deficit to pay for this plan. Right now, now, this country essentially taxes students by charging high interest rates that bring money into the government, while at the same time we give away far more money through a tax code riddled with loopholes and let the wealthiest individuals and corporations avoid paying a fair share. We can close those loopholes and put the money directly into refinancing student loans. We can start with the Buffett rule, a rule that would limit tax loopholes for the wealthy and ensure that billionaires pay at least as much as their secretaries. For every new dollar that we bring in by stitching up this loophole, it can go directly into reducing the cost of student loans for our students. Dollar for dollar, we can invest in billionaires or we can invest in our students. This is about opportunity. Our country should offer a helping hand to young people who are working hard to try to build a future, not a handout to billionaires who've already made it. Refinancing student loans won't fix everything that's broken in the higher education system, but it's a huge step forward. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. I went to a commuter college where the tuition was $50 a semester. I went to a public law school where I got a great education. I was able to do that because I grew up in a country that chose investing in kids over investing in billionaires. I believe in that America, and I believe in what we can do when we work together to build opportunities for everyone who busted their tail to get an education. Thank you, Madam President. I yield back.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Well, thank you, Madam President. I, again, want to compliment my colleagues, Senator Durbin, Senator Warren, Senator Gillibrand, on their commitment to reinvigorating our higher education policy and doing it in an efficient, cost-effective way so that a generation of students aren't so burdened that they cannot essentially rise up, buy homes, start families, do the things that my generation took for granted because there was strong support for higher education at every level of government. But before I leave the floor, Madam President, I want to turn to another key issue that requires urgent action, and that is the renewal of unemployment benefits for millions of people. It's now been 46 days since unemployment insurance expired for many job seekers, and today their ranks have swollen to 1.8 million Americans, including 20,000 veterans who've lost their emergency unemployment insurance benefits. Getting Americans back to work and accelerating job growth should be Congress's top priority, our #1 job. We all understand the answer to this is having a situation where there are not 3 applicants for each job. There is a good job for each applicant, and we have more to do. But in the meantime, we have to address the crisis in these families who have worked hard all their lives. They only qualify for unemployment insurance if they've lost a job through no fault of their own and are looking for work. But in that search, it's difficult. And it's certainly difficult to get by, pay the rent, put gas in the car, keep a cell phone operating to take the call from a potential employer when we cut off the modest benefits of roughly $300 and $350 a week. Doing this has historically been a bipartisan endeavor. We've all recognized in our communities, regardless of where they're located in this country, people who have worked hard, who are struggling, and need assistance to make their transition from unemployment back to reemployment. And I'm particularly troubled today by the way some people are commenting about the unemployed, suggesting that they don't have the backbone or the character to work, that this is a great deal for them, getting $300 a week, when in fact, one of the obvious points to me at least of this crisis of unemployment is it's not young entry-level workers. Too often it's middle-aged individuals who have done extremely well in their lives and now for the first time are coming into unemployment situations because of technology, because of changes in the workforce. They're good people and they deserve our support. But instead they're being mischaracterized, dismissed, ignored, perhaps the most dangerous aspect of this problem. We were only one Republican short of a filibuster that would allow us, at least temporarily, to help these people out. And I want to thank all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who have worked very conscientiously, consistently, and thoughtfully on this critical matter. And if one more of our colleagues can recognize the need to do this, then we can do it, and we should do it. We are, I believe, on the verge of addressing the issue of military COLA reductions. That is something important that we have to do. But let me point out, that does not go into effect until December 2015. There is no veteran that has lost his or her COLA yet, but there are 1.8 million Americans and growing that have already lost their benefits for unemployment insurance, their extended benefits. So the immediacy of this problem is compelling, and we have to deal with it. We've never turned our back when long-term unemployment was so significant. We've always stood up and said, we'll help you. Not indefinitely. In fact, in 2012, I was part of the conference committee that made significant reforms in the unemployment system. One reform was to cut back the weeks from 99 to 73. We provided the ability of states to have innovative programs in terms of putting people in jobs, in terms of making sure that job search was being thoroughly conducted by recipients. These reforms have been made. What we have asked for is a short extension of the program. And I think that's what we should be asking for at this juncture. But as we progress and as we get close to the point where the 3 months has expired, I think we have to think more about what are we going to do in the long run, because we're still going to have millions of people that do not have work. We have, I think, and we've demonstrated by these votes, members on both sides that want to get this done. We need one more vote to procedurally move forward. I hope we can get that vote. And, Madam President, with that, I would relinquish our time. I believe under the UC that is prevailing that we will now go into executive session. With that, I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Senator from Alabama.
I would ask to speak in morning business for 7 minutes.
Without objection.
I would thank you, and I would yield the floor if some people want to speak in executive session on the issues of their nominations. Madam President, in the Budget Committee yesterday, I'm ranking Republican on the Budget Committee. Director Elmendorf of the Congressional Budget Office gave us a report in his projections for next year and what the consequences and financial situation will be for our country as he projects it. His projections of economic growth, when I asked him about it, he acknowledged have been way too high the last several years, and that's been disappointing. Our growth has not reached the level we want it to reach, and he projects now a lower growth rate than he had been projecting for the next 10 years. But let me just share with you, colleagues, as we vote on these matters in which we want to help veterans and we want to help unemployed, and we can do that, but we've got to remember who we are, what we're doing, and how we got here. We've virtually doubled the deficit in the last 10 years of the United States of America, the total debt of the United States of America. Deficits are going down the last couple of years, and will one more year, according to Mr. Elmendorf, but then we'll begin an inexorable rise to nearly $1 trillion deficits at the end of 10 years from today. The interest that we pay, and he testified to this, it's in his report, the interest that we paid last year on the total debt of the United States, even with extraordinarily low interest rates, was $230 billion. Amazing amount of money. We got a group testifying right now about the highway bill. They'd like to see more money spent on our infrastructure and highways. Mr. Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Donahue, Mr. Trumka, the top union leader, they all agree we need to spend more on highways. Last year, the interest that we paid on the debt, according to Dr. Elmendorf, was $230 billion. That's a stunning figure. It's half the total the budget for the Defense Department. But let me tell you what he said that's most troubling. Projecting a modest increase in interest rates over the next 10 years and the increased deficits that we will see, Mr. Elmendorf predicted last year that in 10 years from now, the one-year interest payment would be $830 billion. We're having a dispute, try to not cut the veterans' retirement, and we should not cut the veterans' retirement the way this was done. It would cost $6 billion over 10 years. You see the difference? We're paying it $230 billion. If you paid at that rate for 10 years, that would be $2.3 trillion. But we're not going to be paying it $230 a year. By the time we get to the 10th year, according to Mr. Elmendorf, we would be spending $890 billion on the interest on the debt that we've accumulated in the United States of America through reckless spending, so much of it producing very little benefit for anybody in the long term. And we cannot continue this. He testified that if interest rates go up 1%, we will pay $1.5 trillion more on interest over 10 years than if it didn't go up 1%. And who knows? He acknowledged. He's no seer. Interest rates, many people predict right now, would surge dramatically. May go up to some of the levels we had in the 1970s. If it did, this country would probably be financially destitute. So I got to say, we're not playing games here. The money of the United States needs to be managed by the elected representatives. They expect us to manage their money wisely. They expect us not to put this country at financial risk. And they have every right, and they have a responsibility, actually, as citizens of this country, to be angry with their Congress, to be angry with their president for running up this kind of debt. It's just not a good thing. So, amazingly, well, let me just start over. So earlier this year, there was deep concern that the Budget Control Act that was passed on a bipartisan basis, signed by President Obama, that limited the growth in spending, didn't cut spending, but over 10 years, spending would increase $8 trillion, increase $8 trillion, instead of increasing $10 trillion. So we saved, quote, $2 trillion. That was deemed too tough this year. So we had the Ryan-Murray bill that it said we're going to fix some of the tight places, and we're going to avoid spending, we're going to put more money in, and we're going to spend more than we agreed to, but we're not going to break the total debt situation because we're going to raise taxes some, and we're going to cut spending some. And one of the cuts they came up with, in secret, without any public hearings or debate, was to cut veterans' retirement plan. And it blew up. It meant $60,000 to $150,000 for retired veterans, how much they would lose in their retirement cost of living. And so I opposed that. And, well, they passed it anyway. A Democratic majority here blocked proposal after proposal. One was to more than pay for it by reducing fraudulent income tax credit checks being sent out to people illegally here who don't qualify for it. That was blocked too. And so what did we have just a few days ago? We had we have a bill to save the veterans so they don't have to have their pensions reduced. And how would they pay for this $6 billion in cost? Why, they wouldn't pay for it at all. There's no payment whatsoever. They actually, by voting and supporting that provision of the prior amendment, co-sponsored by a number of Democrats. It would increase the spending of the United States above the agreement.
Senator's time has expired.
Madam Chair, I would ask for one additional minute, and I'll wrap up. Consent to have one
Without
additional
objection.
It would have added to the debt of the United States directly above the agreement that we just voted on in Ryan Murray. It set the cap on how much spending. So less than 2 months later, we're in here directly having to defend against a proposal that would have broken the spending agreement that was in the Ryan Murray legislation. It's just unthinkable. I can't imagine that this would happen. There's so many places we could pay for this kind of restoration of veteran retirement benefit without raising taxes and without adding to the debt. So I guess I'm saying I'm frustrated about the mindset of this Congress. I don't think we are focused on the threat that this debt poses America. Dr. Elmendorf told us we are on an unsustainable path, and he began to discuss the danger of a fiscal crisis like we had in 2007 because we're in such a red zone, a marginal zone of debt. Madam President, I see the Majority Leader. I know he's busy, and I would yield the floor.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
we are not in a quorum call, are we?
We are not.
I have 10 unanimous consent requests have been approved by me and Senator McConnell. I ask consent that these requests be agreed to that allows committees to meet during today's session and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, I now ask unanimous consent that following the series of votes scheduled for 11:30 this morning and the resumption of the legislative session, notwithstanding the previous order, the time until 1:45 be equally divided between the two leaders or the designees. That at 1:45 this afternoon, the chair lay before the body the message from the House to accompany S-540. Following reporting of that message, the Majority Leader or designee be recognized to move to concur in the House amendment to S-540. That if a cloture motion is filed on the motion to concur, the Senate proceed to vote immediately on the motion and vote cloture on the motion to concur. That if cloture is invoked, all post-cloture time be yielded, and the Senate proceed to vote on the motion to concur in the House amendment to S-540. That on the disposition of the House message to accompany S-540, the chair lay before the body the House message to accompany S-25, with remaining provisions of the previous order remaining in effect, with the debate time modified to be 2 minutes equally divided in the usual form prior to the vote on the motion to concur in House amendment to S-25. That if cloture is not invoked on the motion to concur in the House amendment to S-540, the chair lay before the body the House message to accompany S-25, with the remaining provisions of the previous order remaining in effect, with the exception of the debate time, which will now be 2 minutes equally divided in the usual form prior to the vote on the motion to concur in House amendment S-25.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations, which the clerk will report.
Nominations: Department of State, Tina S. Kidenow of the District of Columbia to be Coordinator for Counterterrorism. Daniel Bennett Smith of Virginia to be an Assistant Secretary. International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Catherine Ann Novelli of Virginia to be United States Alternate Governor. Department of State, Catherine Ann Novelli of Virginia to be an Undersecretary.
Under the previous order, there will be 30 minutes for debate equally divided and controlled in the usual form.
Madam President.
The Senator from New Jersey.
Madam President, it's my hope that we don't have to use 30 minutes, but let me start off by say that I'm very pleased that we have 3 highly qualified nominees for posts at the State Department that are critical to America's national security and economic diplomacy. These nominees were voted out favorably by the Foreign Relations Committee. Ambassador Tina Katenow is well qualified to serve as coordinator for counterterrorism at the Department of State. In a long career, most recently she served as the deputy ambassador at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. In Kabul, she worked on some of the most difficult and pressing terrorism issues the United States faces, and she previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. Ambassador Katenow has shown the ability to forge the type of partnerships necessary to advance the counterterrorism objectives and national security of the United States, and I hope all of my colleagues will join me in supporting her nomination. Next is Daniel Bennett Smith, the President's nominee for Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research. This is an incredibly important position as the State Department thinks about our advocacy abroad in terms of foreign policy. Having the best information on intelligence and research is critically important, and certainly playing a role as it relates to embassy security across the globe is very important. Ambassador Smith served as the U.S. Ambassador to Greece from 2010 to 2013. He's been a career officer in the Senior Foreign Service rank with the rank of a career minister. He's served as Executive Secretary of the State Department, as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Consular Affairs, Deputy Executive Secretary. If confirmed, he will advise the State Department officials on many intelligence issues the Department faces, issues that are critical to policymakers' decisions as they relate to the U.S. foreign policy efforts, and I urge my colleagues to support his nomination. Finally, Catherine Ann Novelli is in a unique opportunity to help us, particularly with our economic diplomacy abroad. With over 3 decades of experience in the public and private sector, including senior levels at Apple and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, Ms. Novelli has shown a deep personal commitment to public service. She'll bring tremendous private sector skills, understanding of the interagency process, knowledge of international economic issues to her role as the most senior economic official at the State Department and as an alternate governor to the important multilateral development banks that are a big part of our efforts abroad. Ms. Novelli's experience at the U.S. Trade Representative, coordinating trade and investment policy for Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, and the leading role she played in many of the most important U.S. trade negotiations of the last 25 years make her an ideal candidate to lead the State Department's engagement in our country's most ambitious trade agenda in generations. And one thing that I find particularly important, as I always advocate questions on international intellectual property rights, and other elements that are important to the United States, who leads the world in innovation. Our private sector is facing tougher international competition, and the world's serious environmental threats and a changing energy landscape are also elements of those challenges. We're fortunate to have someone with Ms. Novelli's expertise in promoting trade and investment and her intimate knowledge of the support needed to ensure our private sector remains globally competitive. She's the right person to oversee the State Department's efforts to increase commerce, open markets, support the rights of workers, and I urge my colleague to support her nomination. These are 3 very important and critical positions, and I look forward to the Senate confirming them. And with that, Madam President, I also ask unanimous consent to yield back all time on both sides, including the 2 minutes prior to the vote.
Is there objection? Without objection. The question now occurs on the Katenow.
I ask for the yeas and nays.